There is a specific, uniquely modern form of political theater that lives in the heavy, suffocating silence between a bombastic claim and a nervous, awkward laugh. It is the friction where the tectonic plates of raw populism and cold technocracy grind against one another, producing not a spark of clarity, but a kind of uncomfortable, suffocating heat. If you watch the recent exchange between Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Mark Carney, cast in this particular drama as Prime Minister Carney, you weren't just watching a briefing on trade. You were witnessing a collision between two entirely different political universes, a microcosm of the crisis currently tearing at the throat of the Western liberal order. It was a moment that felt less like a strategic briefing on trade policy and more like a high-speed collision between two distinct political realities. On one side, we have Mr. Ford, the pugnacious premier, a man who carries himself with a certain brand of Trumpian bravado, claiming with absolute certainty that a television commercial featuring Ronald Reagan was the greatest ad ever run in the history of the medium. He didn't just praise it. He cited a viewership number of 12.4 billion, a figure that, as any schoolchild could tell you, exceeds the total human population of our planet by several billion. On the other side of the stage stands Mr. Carney, the central banker turned statesman, offering a facial expression that can only be described as a masterclass in pained institutional restraint. You might be tempted to look at this and see nothing more than a funny clip, a bit of provincial drama to fill a slow news cycle. But I am here to suggest to you that it is something far more significant, far more dangerous. It is a portrait of the deep structural anxiety gnawing at the very foundations of the North American economy and the very concept of neighborly relations between free nations. When we strip away the hyperbole and the uncomfortable chuckles, what remains is a stark reality that you, as a citizen and a voter, must eventually confront. The consensus that has governed North American prosperity for decades is fracturing. The quiet, boring, efficient movement of goods across the longest undefended border in the world is being systematically dismantled. We are witnessing the return of tariffs not merely as economic tools, but as heavy weapons of cultural warfare. In this jagged new landscape, political leaders are desperately scrambling to find the right language, the right posture, and yes, the right advertising just to survive the day. Premier Ford's decision to invoke the ghost of Ronald Reagan is particularly telling, and it drips with a historical irony that I suspect is completely lost on the very people it is meant to persuade. To understand why a Canadian premier feels the desperate need to resurrect a 40-year-old American president to scold a modern Republican administration, we have to look far beyond viral video counts. We have to look at the total crumbling of an intellectual tradition. Consider the sheer spectacle of the moment. You have a provincial leader, a man whose mandate is technically local, focused on roads, hospitals, and schools, stepping directly into the global geopolitical arena. Why? Because the vacuum left by the collapse of international trade norms is now so vast and so powerful that it sucks everyone in. Ford defends his ad with the zeal of a man who truly believes that noise is the only synonym for influence. If he didn't comment on it, Ford says of the American president, maybe only 12.4 people would be viewing it. There is a crude, axiomatic truth to this. In an age where attention is the only currency that actually matters, the ability to provoke a reaction from the White House, even a negative one, is seen as a victory in itself, regardless of the long-term diplomatic cost. But notice the differential, almost apologetic caveat Ford offers immediately after his boast. He speaks of Reagan as the greatest president that ever lived, and then pivots to the current American president, acknowledging that a little bird whispered in his ear. This is the dance of the modern vassal state trying to placate an unpredictable imperial center. It is a humiliating, precarious position for a sovereign nation or a province to occupy. Yet Ford stands there with a strange, jarring mixture of defiance and submission. Then we have Mr. Carney. In this scenario, he represents the head of government, and his role is theoretically to embody the dignity and stability of the state. His reaction, that grimace, that suppressed, pained laugh, is the reaction of the institutionalist who knows that the rules of the game have changed, and they have changed for the worse. When Ford asserts that protectionism does not work, he is merely reciting the catechism of the post-war order. He is correct, of course. Protectionism is a philosophy of subtraction. It makes everyone poorer to satisfy the fleeting resentments of a few. But the fact that this argument now has to be made via viral videos and the invocation of dead presidents suggests that the institutions designed to manage these disputes, the WTO, the USMCA, the quiet professional channels of diplomacy, have simply atrophied. You are watching a desperate improvisation because the script we relied on for half a century has been shredded and thrown to the wind. Why should you care about a premier's exaggeration or a prime minister's grimace? Because these are the men currently steering your ship of state through a Category 5 hurricane. The fortress North America that Ford alludes to, a unified economic bloc capable of competing with the rising powers of Asia and the established markets of Europe, is a noble and necessary goal. It is the logical extension of the geography and history we share. But you cannot build a fortress when the architects are shouting at each other from across the street and the foundation is being chipped away by the heavy pickaxe of tariffs. The ad in question, which uses Reagan's voice to preach a gospel of unity, highlights the tragedy of our current moment. We have the technology to reach billions, yet we lack a shared language to agree on basic economic reality. The Republican Party of the United States, once the Church of Free Trade, has transformed into a vehicle for a neo-mercantilism that views every single transaction as a zero-sum conquest. And Canada, the polite, reliable neighbor, is finding that politeness is no longer a sufficient shield against a blunt force trauma policy. The mechanism of this dysfunction is worth examining closely. Ford admits with a candor that is almost disarming, "I am in a very different position than the Prime Minister." He acknowledges the heavy burden of the head of state to sit across from the American president and maintain the decorum of high office. This separation of roles, the bad cop premier and the good cop prime minister, might seem like a clever, coordinated strategy on the surface. But is it? Or is it actually a sign of a disjointed, chaotic foreign policy where domestic political posturing overrides the national interest? When the premier says he is not going to sit back and roll over, he isn't talking to Washington. He is speaking to you. He is speaking to the voter in Ontario, the worker in the steel mill in Hamilton, the family whose entire livelihood depends on the auto sector. He is channeling your fear, but fear is a poor substitute for a strategy. And laughter, however cathartic it might feel in the moment, is not a policy. We must dig deeper into what this ad represents. It is a desperate attempt to bypass the messy, difficult, and often invisible work of diplomacy and appeal directly to the American psyche, or at least to the psyche of one specific American. It is a massive gamble that nostalgia for Reagan can somehow override the current populist impulse. But history is not a vending machine where you can simply insert a coin of nostalgia and retrieve a preferred policy. The forces driving protectionism in the United States today are deep-seated and generational. They are born of decades of deindustrialization, profound cultural anxiety, and a deep distrust of international agreements. A video clip, no matter how many views it allegedly garners, cannot reverse the tides of history. It can only illuminate them. The friction between Ford and Carney in that clip is the friction between the noisy, messy reality of democratic politics and the cool, detached logic of governance. Ford is the id of the electorate shouting that he will fight. Carney is the superego, aware of the constraints, the risks, and perhaps deeply embarrassed by the crudity of the tactics, but unable to offer a better alternative in the heat of the moment. And you, the viewer, are caught right in the middle. You are the one whose job is on the line. You are the one who will pay the higher prices at the grocery store when the tariffs bite. You are the one watching your leaders perform this awkward, off-key duet, wondering if anyone actually knows the tune. This brings us to the core of the issue, the collapse of the shared assumptions that once made such ads unnecessary. There was a time when the benefits of trade were considered a settled fact, like gravity or the sunrise. There was a time when a premier did not need to act as a rogue diplomat. There was a time when a prime minister could rely on a single quiet phone call rather than a viral moment. That time has passed. We are now in an era of performative governance, where the appearance of fighting is often prized far above the actual achievement of a result. And in this theater, the line between tragedy and farce is perilously, dangerously thin. As we look at the specific machinery of these tariffs and the political incentives driving them, we see a stress test of the Canadian Federation itself. Can a province effectively run its own foreign policy? Can a prime minister lead when his provincial counterparts are freelancing on the world stage? These are constitutional questions just as much as they are political ones, and the answers will determine the stability of your community for years to come. Let us be precise about the event that precipitated this tableau, because the details matter less for their accuracy than for what they reveal about the participants' state of mind. Premier Ford, the leader of Canada's most populous province and the engine of its manufacturing economy, released a video advertisement. This was not a standard partisan attack ad aimed at a domestic rival. It was a diplomatic communique disguised as a television spot aimed squarely at the American electorate and, more importantly, an audience of one, the President-elect of the United States. The ad utilized the voice and image of Ronald Reagan, the 40th American president, extolling the virtues of free trade and the sanctity of the North American partnership. It was, in effect, an attempt to weaponize the Republican Party's past against its present, using the great communicator to lecture the current populist standard-bearer on the dangers of protectionism. Mr. Ford claims this video received 12.4 billion views. Now, a skeptical mind, and I encourage you always to cultivate a skeptical mind, might note that this figure exceeds the total human population of Earth. But to dwell on the arithmetic is to miss the point. In the Premier's calculus, and indeed in the calculus of the modern media age, the truth of the number is secondary to the dominance it signifies. He is signaling to you, his constituents, and to the Americans that he has broken through the noise. He reports that the American president initially reacted favorably, allegedly saying, "If I was Canada, I'd run the ad too," before a little bird, a delightful euphemism for a hardline advisor or perhaps a cable news host, whispered in his ear, prompting a reversal. This anecdote, whether entirely factual or apocryphal, perfectly encapsulates the volatility of current American governance, where policy seems to oscillate based on the last voice heard by the executive. But what are the actual stakes here? We are not merely talking about hurt feelings or bruised egos. When Premier Ford rattles off the list of sectors under threat, steel, automotive, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, he is describing the nervous system of the Ontario economy. He is describing your job, your neighbor's pension, and the viability of your community. These industries do not exist in a vacuum. They are integrated into a continental supply chain that has been painstakingly built over decades. A carburetor might cross the border 4 or 5 times before it ends up in a finished vehicle. When a tariff is introduced, essentially a tax on imports, it acts like sand thrown into the gears of a fine-tuned machine. It raises costs, delays production, and ultimately it makes everyone poorer. The protectionism that Ford rightly decries is a policy that masquerades as strength, but functions as a self-imposed blockade. To understand why this is happening, we must look at the institutional decay that allowed us to reach this point. For nearly 30 years, trade between Canada and the United States was governed by a consensus that recognized our economies as inextricably linked. This was codified first in the FTA, then NAFTA, and recently the USMCA. These agreements were supposed to be the guardrails. They were designed to prevent exactly this kind of erratic behavior, creating a rules-based order where disputes were settled by tribunals, not by tweets or threats. What you are witnessing in Mr. Ford's frantic ad campaign and Mr. Carney's uncomfortable silence is the realization that those guardrails have failed. The treaty still exists on paper, but the spirit that animated it, the belief in mutual benefit, has evaporated in Washington. The political context here is equally fascinating and troubling. We are seeing a reversal of traditional roles that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The Republican Party, once the evangelist of open markets and the party of Reagan, has turned inward, embracing a neo-mercantilism that views trade deficits as moral failings and allies as economic parasites. Meanwhile, a Canadian Conservative premier finds himself invoking a liberal internationalist argument, appealing to the memory of a Republican icon to save Canadian industry from a Republican administration. It is a disorienting realignment, and it leaves you, the voter, in a precarious position. You are watching your leaders try to navigate a world where the old maps no longer match the territory. There is another layer to this, one that touches on the very structure of our federation. Did you notice Mr. Ford's comment about signing a deal with the governor of New York? I talk to governors almost every week, he says. This is significant. Under our Constitution, foreign policy is the preserve of the federal government. It is the Prime Minister's prerogative to speak for Canada abroad. But here we have a provincial premier conducting his own shadow diplomacy, bypassing Ottawa to cut deals directly with American states. He justifies this by claiming he is the frontline guy, implying that the federal government represented here by the silent, grimacing Mr. Carney is too detached, too diplomatic, or perhaps too compromised to fight effectively. This is not just a tactical disagreement. It is a fracturing of national unity in the face of an external threat. When a province feels it must conduct its own foreign relations because it does not trust the federal strategy, the nation speaks with a cacophony of voices rather than a single clear tone. Why should you care about this fragmentation? Because a divided house is easily conquered. If every province attempts to cut its own side deals with Washington, the leverage of the Canadian nation is pulverized. The Americans, masters of the divide and conquer strategy, will happily pit Ontario against Quebec or the West against the center, extracting concessions from each that undermine the whole. Mr. Ford's approach, while understandable as a defense of his specific constituents, risks accelerating this disintegration. He is acting out of necessity, yes, but it is a necessity born of a vacuum at the center. The mechanics of this situation, how a tariff threat translates into a television ad and then into a diplomatic incident, reveal a system that is operating on pure adrenaline and very little strategy. The tariff itself is a blunt instrument. Under U.S. trade law, specifically Section 232, the President has broad authority to impose tariffs if imports are deemed a threat to national security. It is an absurdity to suggest that Canadian steel or Canadian cars threaten American national security, but the law allows the President to define that term however he wishes. This legal loophole turns the stable rule of law into a game of executive whim. And so we end up in a world where a Canadian premier feels he must spend taxpayer money on an ad campaign to remind the Americans of their own history, hoping that a 30-second clip of Ronald Reagan can do what the USMCA apparently cannot, guarantee the free flow of goods. This brings us to the human element, the psychology of the leaders involved. Mr. Ford acts with the bluster of a man who believes that strength is demonstrated through volume. He talks of fighting like I've never fought before, framing trade policy as a brawl. Mr. Carney, by contrast, represents the technocratic elite, the class of people who believe that rational arguments and spreadsheets should carry the day. His laughter, that pained, awkward chuckle, is the sound of a worldview colliding with a reality it can no longer control. He knows that 12.4 billion views is a fiction. He knows that governing by viral video is unsustainable. But he also knows that in the current climate, rationality is at a disadvantage. You are watching two different definitions of politics struggle for dominance. One that prizes disruption and noise, and one that prizes order and process. And right now, the noise is winning. As we peel back the layers of this story, we must ask ourselves how we arrived at a moment where the best ad ever run is the primary shield of our economic sovereignty. It suggests a deep failure of the quiet, boring work of relationship building that used to define Canada-U.S. relations. It suggests that we have entered an era where institutions are hollow and only personalities matter. And for a country like Canada, which relies on the rule of law to protect it from the overwhelming power of its neighbor, that is a dangerous place to be. We are trading the security of a contract for the volatility of a handshake or a snub. We are examining a political mechanism that has jumped the tracks to understand the friction between Premier Ford and Mr. Carney, and indeed the friction between Canada and the United States. We must look at the incentives that propel these men. In a healthy polity, the incentive is to solve the problem. In a performative polity, the incentive is to be seen solving the problem, or at least to be seen inflicting damage on the source of the problem. Premier Ford is operating under the latter set of rules. He faces a domestic electorate that is anxious, feeling the bite of inflation and the threat of economic dislocation. For a provincial leader, the greatest danger is not failure, but the appearance of passivity. If the tariffs come and the factories close, he must be able to say, "I fought. I made the ad. I yelled at the clouds." The 12.4 billion figure, absurd on its face, is not a metric of viewership. It is a metric of effort. It is a rhetorical shield designed to deflect blame when the inevitable economic winter arrives. Contrast this with the burden carried by Mr. Carney and, by extension, the federal government. Their incentive structure is radically different. They are the signatories of the treaties. They are the ones who must sit in the boring, fluorescent-lit rooms in Geneva or Washington and parse the minutiae of rules of origin and dispute settlement mechanisms. When Mr. Carney winces at Mr. Ford's bluster, it is not merely snobbery. It is the recognition that every time a premier pokes the bear for domestic applause, the federal negotiators have a harder time keeping the bear from tearing down the tent. The mechanism of diplomacy relies on predictability, on the assurance that a nation speaks with one voice. When that voice cracks into a falsetto of competing claims, the adversary, in this case, a protectionist American administration, sees only weakness. Consider the specific machinery of subnational diplomacy that Mr. Ford brags about. He tells us he is going to New York to sign a deal with the governor. He tells us he talks to senators and Congress people daily. On the surface, this sounds like industriousness. In reality, it is a symptom of a disorderly retreat. When the national government cannot secure the border for trade, the provinces revert to a kind of feudal scramble, each baron trying to cut a separate piece with the neighboring kingdom. It is a return to a pre-Confederation mindset, where Ontario looks out for Ontario, and the concept of the Canadian interest dissolves into a collection of regional anxieties. This is how a nation loses its leverage. If New York can get what it wants from Ontario directly, what incentive does Washington have to offer concessions to Ottawa? The mechanism of the state is being short-circuited by the very people claiming to defend it. We must also look at the key actors here, not just as individuals, but as archetypes of a changing world. Mr. Ford represents the new rough-edged populism that has learned to speak the language of the internet. Viral hits, big numbers, emotional appeals. He understands that in the current media ecosystem, a quiet success is no success at all. If you save the steel plant, but nobody sees the fight, did you really save it? Mr. Carney represents the receding tide of the old establishment, credentialed, careful, and fundamentally ill-equipped to wrestle in the mud. He brings a briefing book to a knife fight. The tragedy for the viewer, for you, is that neither approach is fully adequate for the moment. The briefing book is useless if the other side tears it up, but the knife fight rarely results in a stable trade agreement. Let us be concrete about what attacking our steel industry actually means. To use Mr. Ford's phrase, it does not mean soldiers at the border. It means a line in a spreadsheet in the U.S. Treasury Department changing a 0 to a 25. That simple clerical act, born of a political impulse in the White House, sends a shockwave that travels down the highway to Hamilton or Sault Ste. Marie. It alters the profit margin of a slab of steel by a fraction that is enough to make it uncompetitive. It means a shift is canceled. It means a truck sits empty. This is the mechanics of the crisis. It is bureaucratic violence. And against this silent mathematical destruction, Mr. Ford offers a loud, colorful video. It is a mismatch of forces. The ad may soothe the psyche of the voter who wants to see their leader fight back, but it does not change the math in the spreadsheet. As we pivot to the wider consequences of this spectacle, we have to ask, what happens when the ad campaign ends and the tariffs remain? What happens to the civic culture of a nation when its leaders normalize the idea that foreign policy is just another branch of public relations? We are teaching the electorate that complex problems yield to simple, loud solutions. We are encouraging a cynicism that says, at least he's entertaining, rather than, is he effective? This is the corrosion of democratic seriousness. The friction between Premier Ford and Mr. Carney, between the ad and the tariff, is the sound of a system breaking down. We are watching a country lose its ability to think strategically because it is too busy performing. We are watching the long-term work of building a continent sacrificed for the short-term sugar high of a viral moment, and the bill for that performance will eventually come due not in billions of views but in billions of dollars of lost prosperity. The fortress North America is under siege, and the most dangerous part is that the architects are too busy arguing about the billboard to notice the walls are coming down. This specific clash over a video and a tariff fits into the larger unraveling of the North American idea, and it means the future of the continent you call home is now being decided by those who prize noise over substance. We have to understand that the security we once took for granted, the open borders, the shared values, the mutual respect, are now fragile things that require more than just a nostalgic video to protect. They require a return to the serious, difficult work of governance and a rejection of the political theater that has brought us to this uncomfortable, pained silence. It is time to look past the hyperbole and the laughter and see the reality for what it is, a challenge that will define our generation and determine whether the North American experiment continues to flourish or slowly grinds to a halt in the heat of its own friction.